One of the great difficulties in understanding prehistory is simply the vast scale of time that's being discussed. If I walk along this beach and I imagine that I'm walking through time, and I pick a scale.
1 millimetre is 1 year. Then the story of the human occupation of Britain would stretch about 1 kilometre. From the earliest traces, footprints almost 1 million years old, to recorded history just the last 2 metres.
So out of all this vast period in time, archaeologists have divided it into convenient periods, if you like, largely based on the stone tools that are found, the technology that existed. You have the Paleolithic, the old Stone Age, the longest period,
lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Almost 99% of our timeline is the Paleolithic.
When we travel like this through the Paleolithic, we are travelling on such a vast timescale that we witness Britain covered by ice sheets which force people out of this land. It becomes uninhabitable, and the traces of these ice ages are to be seen in the cliffs here, where the sediments left down by the meltwaters as the ice receded. And there were several periods during this time when people couldn't live in Britain.
But when the ice retreated during the so-called interglacial periods, people returned to Britain. Ours is a story of waves of migration. And finally, around 40,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, were living here.
They've made this journey from Africa through the Middle East and have found their way to Britain. But we are still in the old Stone Age. Why did our ancestors continue in this way for so long without change? And I think it's because the technology they employed worked. It worked for what they were doing.
For almost a kilometre, I've been walking the Paleolithic. But now, finally, I'm approaching the end of the old Stone Age.
You see that flag? That represents today. And now I'm about 12 metres from today, 12,000 years into the past, and I leave the Paleolithic. I'm now entering the Middle Stone Age, the Mesolithic. It's an interesting time. There's a very great change in the use of stone tools. Now, instead of heavy hand axes, we see the use of tiny flakes of flint. It's a fascinating and mysterious period in history.
Britain, an island where history is part of the landscape. Where human feet have walked for 1 million years.
In this series, I'm going to explore Britain's distant past, from the earliest evidence of people in Britain right up to the moment that everything would change.
I'm going to discover how our ancestors survived from hunting and from gathering. I'll discover the technologies they used, the knowledge that they passed down, and the traces that they left behind.
I mean, it's mind-blowing. Yeah, 1 million years ago, right here, there was a family of people with mammoths.
This is the story of ancient Britain.
Get exclusive documentaries and ad-free podcasts with top historians. Watch on your smart TV or mobile device by downloading the History Hit app.
In the first programme, we saw how our oldest ancestors made and used flint tools like hand axes. Flint was also used to make spears, the main weapon of the Paleolithic hunter.
During the Mesolithic, there was a revolutionary change in hunting technology. Perhaps it came about because there was an increase in vegetation in the landscape, but it's in the Mesolithic that the bow and arrow were invented, and that would change hunting forever. To really understand the bow and arrow, it's good to have a look at the arrow more closely, because actually it's quite a sophisticated tool. And I'm going to make one to show you.
Organic matter rarely survives, so what we know of Mesolithic arrows comes from the stone arrowheads we've found. I'm going to make my arrowhead here at one of Britain's only flint quarries. I start with a flake left over from making a flint hand axe.
A deer antler like this roe deer antler here is very useful for a different type of flint working where we apply pressure directly to the edge. What I'm looking at making is a leaf point arrowhead, and this end of the flint is thick, so that'll be the point, because it's difficult to slot the thick end of the flint into the shaft, and the thinner end will be the base of the point. So the first job is to really start to take control of the shape, and also to thin down the thick end a little bit by driving some little flakes, micro flakes, across the surface of the flint. And I go backwards and forwards as I work my way along the edge. When you consider that we used flint tools for most of human history, you probably won't then be surprised to learn that there are certain revolutions that took place in the manufacturing technology and the way we did things with this material in the past. And archaeologists can classify the time period a tool was made by the technique that was employed to produce it. But of course, technological advancements back then took much longer than today. We live in an age where we expect revolutionary changes in technology overnight. Things took much longer in the past.
I'm making a leaf-shaped arrowhead, one of the simplest designs, but later arrowheads developed barbs to make them stick into the prey. The craftsmanship of some of these flints is extraordinary.
Our ancestors were clever, and if you've ever tried to work flint, you very quickly discover how clever they were, how skilled they were. Working flint is quite fun, and in many ways you go on a voyage of discovery of our evolutionary past when you work this material. And at any stage in the production, one slip and it can break, because this is akin to glass. So it's strong and sharp, but it's also fragile. So there it is, and you can see it has a naturally serrated edge. I've used the thick end of the blade for the point for strength, and the thinner end so that it can easily be mounted. So the next task for this is to actually turn it into an arrow.
And that means it's time to go back to the forest to find some wood.
This is hazel. It wouldn't be my choice of wood, and neither would it have been, I think, our ancestors' choice of wood. A much better choice would be Guelder rose, which is stiffer. But when needs must, there's no Guelder rose here. The hunter must use what's available to him. And I'll collect a few sticks for this purpose. I base what I'm doing on what I've seen hunter-gatherers do in Africa. I'm going to take off the bark, and I now need to dry this wood and straighten it. I know it looks quite straight, but an arrow needs to be very straight to be accurate. I quite like making arrows like this. It may seem time consuming, but yeah, our ancestors had plenty of time. I need to dry the moisture out of the wood so that it stiffens it and also prevents it, it'll shrink in the process. If I don't do that, then of course once I've tied anything onto it, the wood will shrink and everything comes loose. A few minutes ago this was a stick, and it's not a stick anymore, it's becoming an arrow, and the key tool in finding food. I'm just hardening the point. Driving the moisture out makes it harder. Okay, so here's the arrowhead, and I have to fit that neatly into the shaft. I'm cutting a groove for the arrowhead. So if you're walking along and you find something like that in the countryside, you know you've found a little Stone Age chisel. These skills really taught me to appreciate our ancestors. Oh, look, we're there. Yep. So there is the arrowhead fitted in place.
The arrowhead is attached using resin glue, which is thermoplastic. It softens when heated and hardens when cooled. Then I attach the feathers, tying them on using strands of plant fibre.
I've done this quickly. It would be nice to take a little bit longer. I would make it a lot neater than this, but it gives you a pretty good impression of what things would have looked like all those years ago. Only one thing remains, and that's to test it. Sadly, very few bows survive from the Mesolithic. We know they were used because we find the projectile points to tell us they were using arrows. Well, what I can tell you is that the bow, when it arrived, was a revolutionary discovery in hunting terms. It's light, it's small, it's compact, it's versatile. You can make many different types of arrow to fit the bow for different jobs. And with a bow you can quickly and easily reach out through thick undergrowth to hit your target. This is a bow I've made from wych elm. It's a copy of a bow that was found in Denmark, and it shoots extremely well. A sweet little flat bow. This is exactly the sort of bow that would be used with this sort of arrow. The arrow flew beautifully straight. If there'd been a red deer sleeping here in this couch, you can see here, it would have been within range. The arrowhead's dislodged a little bit, but that's an easy fix over the fire. You just soften the glue and fix it back in place.
Our ancestors used technology like this for hunting, but they were also gatherers, collecting wild plant foods from the land. So what kind of environment did they live in?
It's hard to imagine what Britain looked like through the vast timescale of the Paleolithic. Certainly there were times when our country was a vast Arctic tundra, but by the Mesolithic things start to warm up. And by the end of that period, our hunter-gatherers were living in a vast, tangled, moist, warm woodland.
There is no truly ancient woodland left in Britain, but here at Puzzlewood in Gloucestershire, you can get some sense of what Britain might have been like.
We know so little about our hunter-gatherer past. What we do know is that tools are often found at rocky overhangs. Perhaps these were more than just shelters, but fixed points in the landscape that people could navigate to on a seasonal basis. But one thing I'm certain of, our ancestors' knowledge of the flora and fauna was exceptional.
And they needed every bit of that knowledge to survive.
the big demand for them on a daily basis was for food. They had to be very adept at finding things that could be eaten in nature. Not everything's edible. At this time of year, things like this, the wild garlic, would certainly have been used. These little flower buds are like pearls of garlic flavour. And of course, at this time of year, at the end of the winter, the beginning of the spring, the diet would have been nutrient deficient. So the sudden flood of salady plants into the forest would have been of great importance. But this plant is more than just food. It's in the onion family, and the juice from that plant can be used as a mild antiseptic. Other things too, like here growing on the rock, there's the polypody fern. This has been used to treat sore throats across northern Europe. The root of the plant, I won't pull it up because I don't want to damage it, but the root has kind of a bitter licorice flavour too. The secret was to know what could be used and where it grows, so that if you see the right habitat, you know what to look for when you get there.
Hunter-gatherers also need to be acutely aware of the seasons.
You know, I absolutely love this time of year because we get so many nice salad plants are coming up. This is golden saxifrage. It's a real golden green colour, and it's a slightly bitter green, but it's nice again in salads. And it's lovely, and it's moist because there was rain last night as well, so it's just delicious. And I'm sure the way I feel is equally the way our ancestors would have felt as the sun starts to climb in the sky at the end of the winter. The staple foods for our ancestors at that time are difficult to establish. We take the availability of potato and rice and wheat so much for granted. But for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, none of those foods were available. For them, they had to be sharp and ready for seasonal gluts like the hazelnut harvest. One can imagine communities preparing gathering baskets in advance of the ripening of the hazelnuts. Acorns were also an important food source. Once oak was growing, that was an abundance of carbohydrate to be gathered. But you can't just eat it raw because it's so rich in tannin. That has to be washed out. So you can imagine again, specialized baskets, not just for storage, but also for leaching out the tannins, perhaps in slow flowing streams. Now this is a site that would have delighted Mesolithic foragers. This is a lime tree, the linden tree. And at this time of year, when the leaves are just opening and they're soft and emerald green, they're as near as you get to lettuce in the wild larder. But this was a useful tree too. The bark from it can be used to make rope. It gets its name, lime, derived from linden or lime tree. The wood is also light and strong and easily carved and could be used to make all manner of utensils, perhaps even dugout canoes. One of my theories is that the bark from large lime trees may well have been the covering of the shelters for many hunter-gatherers in Britain during the Mesolithic.
Hunting and gathering was the lifestyle of the first humans in Britain and lasted almost 1 million years, nearly all of the 1,000 metres on our beach timeline. But just 6 metres from the present day, the Mesolithic comes to an end. It's now the Neolithic, the new Stone Age, and there's a new way of life.
Around 4000 BC, it's believed that a new type of people arrived in Britain. They brought with them a revolution in food production, farming.
Instead of relying on wild plants and animals, we now planted crops, domesticated versions of naturally occurring plants that had been selected for their high yields, and they domesticated animals, starting with sheep and goats.
Farming had had its origins in the valleys of the upper Euphrates around 12,000 BC, so it took 6,000 years to come here. But when it did, it changed everything. All of a sudden, there was a hunger for land. Flint tools changed, they evolved. It's at this time we see polished axes that are resilient for the felling of trees. hafted in wood or antler and wood, they would see the clearance of a lot of the natural landscape. It's also believed that the early farmers had a nutrient-poor diet. They weren't eating such a diverse range of foods as the hunter-gatherers, who relied a lot on fish and on wild greens harvested from nature. Personally, I'd rather be a hunter-gatherer than a farmer.
It's thought that early farmers actually had shorter life expectancy than their forebears. Nevertheless, the farming lifestyle did have some advantages.
People had a store of food to see them through difficult times. It led to more time for culture and also for warfare. All of a sudden, people needed land, and good land was worth protecting and fighting for. This changed the landscape of Britain forever. A lot of the fields that we're used to today had their origins at this time. It may be strange to think, but in many parts of Britain where we see bigger open fields, those fields may have been cleared during this period, the Neolithic.
And our ancestors started to build permanent structures, physical manifestations of their beliefs that survive to this day.
I've never been here before, and I'm keen to see this. This is Belus Nap, which is a burial mound from the Neolithic. It's over 5,500 years old. This impressive entranceway is a little bit puzzling. Although there were some skeletons found behind the big stone, there's no chamber. It could well be that this represents perhaps a gateway to the afterlife in the minds of the people who built this monument. You could be forgiven for thinking that this is all hollow inside, but it's actually not. The burials were made in small chambers along the sides. But if you come around here, you can see the scale of it. It's a great long, slightly tapered mound. It obviously had some symbolic meaning to the religious life of the Neolithic farmers in this area. I find it fascinating. Maybe this is some sort of vehicle to ensure the safe transportation of spirits to the afterlife. Lovely cowslips growing on top of it. That's a nice sight. There were 14 skeletons in here of varying ages. I'm not going to go inside because to me this is a place of the dead, and I think it's good to respect the spirits of the past. But isn't it stunning? I mean, it's a beautiful testimony to the care with which people were buried. I mean, I find places like this interesting. There's a huge investment of labour gone in to making this, which means that people felt that the afterlife, their mortality, these things were of significance. It is a bit of a puzzlement though as well at the same time. Why didn't earlier cultures do the same thing? Well, maybe they didn't have the time. They were too busy foraging and hunting. Farmers have more time, and also farmers rely on a seasonal connection with the land in a slightly different way. A forager can move around a landscape and go to a resource as it flowers or it fruits, or if the salmon run, they can position themselves in the right place. But a farmer, they lock themselves statically in the landscape. They clear a space, they make their fields, they bring in their livestock, and they say, this is where I live. And they are then at the whim of the elements. So there can be a degree of superstition that creeps into the farming life, particularly given the vagaries of fluctuations in climate and weather patterns. It's hardly surprising that perhaps for these people there was a sense of divine intervention or divine malice even in their fortunes, which would make them think more carefully about the next life and the spirit world. Interestingly, in this particular chamber, some of the skulls showed signs of violence, of the heads being crushed in, and it's believed that that could represent early conflict in the Neolithic period. And Of course, the other aspect to these sort of monuments is that they define the length of occupation that you and your clan have been in a place. It's a further attestation of this is ours. Perhaps that's something that's more in the mind of new arrivals in a landscape. It's quite a thought.
And now the pace of change gets even faster. In Britain, the Neolithic lasts just a couple of thousand years, only 2 meters on our 1 kilometer timeline. The Stone Age is about to come to an end with the discovery, the harnessing of metal.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.